Have you ever looked at an old photograph of a snowstorm and thought it looked peaceful? The world draped in white, the sounds of the city muffled, the figures blurred by the falling flakes. What if that peaceful-looking snow was not a gentle blanket, but the beginning of a 48-hour apocalypse? A frozen siege that would bring the most advanced, most confident, and most powerful city on earth to its very knees. We are about to journey back to New York City in March of 1888. This was a city of titans and tenements, a city of dazzling new inventions, a city utterly convinced of its own invincibility. It is a fascinating and chilling story, and I am so glad you have decided to join me for it. If you enjoy these quiet trips into the past, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It is a simple, kind gesture that truly helps us create more of these stories for you. I always love to see how far these stories travel, so please feel free to share where you are listening from and what time it is for you in the comments below. For now, just find a comfortable spot, take a slow, deep breath, and let the sounds of your world fade away as we travel back in time together. Welcome to Sleeping Scribe, where calming history stories help you unwind and gently fall asleep. Tonight, we witness how a city that had conquered the sky and tamed the earth was about to be humbled by the wind and the snow. Beginning on an ordinary Saturday that felt just like any other. In 1888, New York City was not just a city. It was a statement. It was the roaring, thumping heart of the Gilded Age, a metropolis of 1.5 million souls, all living in a grand, chaotic, and profoundly unequal experiment. This was a city of staggering confidence. If you stood in Lower Manhattan, your gaze would be drawn upward, not just to the tangle of buildings, but to the brand new marvel that stitched the city together. The Brooklyn Bridge, a steel harp strung across the East River, had been open for just 5 years. It was a miracle of engineering, a symbol of the era's boundless ambition, a testament to the idea that nothing, not even the great river, could stand in the way of human progress. The sky itself was a marvel of a different kind. Look up from any street corner, and you would see a dense, chaotic canopy of wires. A dark web of telegraph and telephone lines crisscrossed the air, a frantic, buzzing nervous system that connected the city to itself and to the world. This was the nerve center of a nation. This was where the Associated Press and Western Union gathered the news of the entire globe and beamed it out again. On Wall Street, the undisputed financial capital of the world, the clatter of stock tickers was the rhythm of modern commerce, a sound that dictated fortunes from coast to coast. And the streets were a symphony of organized chaos. The air itself was thick with a unique blend of smells. The sharp, metallic temps of coal smoke from thousands of chimneys, the sweet, warm scent of roasted chestnuts from street vendors, and the earthy, ever-present odor of horse manure from the thousands of wagons and carriages that clogged the cobblestones. Above this chaos, the city had built its own solution. 4 major elevated train lines, run by companies like the Manhattan Railway Company, rattled and hissed on iron trestles above the crowded avenues. These steam-powered trains were the height of urban transit, their rhythmic clatter and the occasional hiss of steam a constant backdrop to city life. At night, the city was a painting of dramatic contrasts. On grand avenues, like Broadway and around fashionable Union Square, the future had arrived. Dazzling, bright electric arc lights cast stark, deep shadows, their intense glare a novelty that drew crowds. But just a block away, the old world remained. The warm, flickering glow of gas lamps still lit most of the city, casting a softer, more forgiving light on the streets. This was a city of extremes. The headquarters of industry and finance were just a short carriage ride away from the Lower East Side, one of the most densely populated places on the entire planet. Here, tens of thousands of immigrants were packed into crowded, dark tenement buildings, living lives a world away from the opulence of the Fifth Avenue mansions. It was a city run by Mayor Abram Hewitt, a reform-minded leader from the complex and often corrupt Tammany Hall political machine, and it was a city of constant entertainment. Just recently, P.T. Barnum's Greatest Show on Earth had finished a dazzling run at Madison Square Garden, filling the city with a vibrant, bustling atmosphere of wonder and spectacle. It was, in short, a city that felt like the pinnacle of human achievement. It had tamed steel, it had conquered distance with the telegraph, and it had even captured lightning in a jar. But this proud, humming, powerful city was about to check the morning newspaper, and it would find no hint, not even a whisper, of the white monster gathering just beyond the horizon. On Saturday, March 10th, 1888, New Yorkers unfolded their morning papers, the crisp rustle of the pages mixing with the scent of breakfast coffee. As they scanned the headlines, many would have glanced at the small weather box, a feature of growing importance provided by the United States Army Signal Corps. The Signal Corps was the official weather authority of the day. Its head was General Adolphus Greely, a famed and hardened Arctic explorer, a man who knew, better than most, the terrible and indifferent power of nature. But the science he commanded was in its infancy. In 1888, there were no satellites, there was no radar. Weather forecasting was a meticulous, earthbound process. It relied on a sparse network of telegraph reports sent in from stations across the country. Forecasters would plot these points of data on a map and then, using their experience, essentially make an educated guess about where the weather was moving next. The system was slow, and it was full of blind spots. The most dangerous blind spot of all was the one just off the coast, the Atlantic Ocean. The forecast for that weekend, and for the coming Monday, March 12th, was utterly and fatally wrong. The newspapers assured their readers of a pleasant end to the weekend. The official prediction for Monday was for light rain, which might, perhaps, turn to a bit of snow. This would be followed by clearing skies and colder temperatures. The winds were described with the mild, unassuming phrase, fresh to brisk. What the Signal Corps observers could not see, what their science could not yet comprehend, was the rare and terrifying confluence of two massive weather systems. Far to the north, a bitter cold Arctic air mass was plunging southward, a river of pure, frigid air. At the same time, a moisture-laden storm, born in the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico, was steaming up the southern coast. This in itself was not unusual. The forecasters saw these two systems. They predicted, reasonably, that the two would meet, as they often did, far out at sea, resulting in nothing more than a powerful ocean storm, a gale that would trouble only the sailors and steamships. But there was a third invisible player on the map. A massive, immovable block of high pressure settled over Canada was barring the storm's path. It was a wall in the atmosphere. The two storms, the Arctic cold and the southern moisture, had nowhere to go. Blocked from their normal path, they were shunted, redirected, and forced to collide directly over the coastline. The result was a phenomenon that modern science has a name for: bombogenesis, a storm that does not just grow, but explodes. Its central pressure plummets with terrifying speed, a process that turns a simple storm into a spinning, raging cyclone of hurricane-force winds. The term blizzard in 1888 was not even in the official forecast. It was a new word, a piece of frontier slang from the Great Plains, used to describe the white-out storms of the Dakotas. It was not a word one associated with the sophisticated coastal metropolis of New York City. And so, the city, in its blissful ignorance, went about its weekend. Saturday was unseasonably mild, with a gentle breeze that gave no hint of the Arctic blast to come. On Sunday morning, the sound of church bells rang out across a city that was completely oblivious to its fate. In the afternoon, families in their Sunday best took advantage of the mild gray weather, strolling through Central Park, enjoying the last moments of a peaceful weekend. That evening, as the city sat down to dinner, a light, steady rain began to fall. It was a gentle, tapping sound on the windows, the smell of damp earth rising from the streets. People read their books, talked by the fire, and prepared for the working week ahead. As the city slept, the barometer, the small, unassuming instrument that measured the weight of the air, began to drop and drop and drop. It was a precipitous, almost vertical fall, a silent scream that no one, except for a few dedicated observers, was there to notice. The city slept soundly under the gentle patter of the rain, unaware that a monster, born of ice and water, was taking its first deep breath just off the coast. The change did not come gradually. It came like a thrown switch in the darkest hours of Sunday night. Around midnight, the city's temperature, which had been in the mild mid-30s, began to fall. It did not just dip, it plummeted. In just a few hours, the mercury dropped into the low 20s, a sudden, biting cold that had the feel of the Arctic. For those few who were still awake, the first sign was a change in sound. The gentle, liquid tapping of rain on the window panes became a frantic, sleety ticking. The rain was freezing. Then, around 12:30 in the morning on Monday, March 12th, the ticking stopped. It was replaced by a new sound, a soft, rushing whisper. The rain had turned to snow. But this was not a gentle, picturesque snowfall. It was heavy, and it was wet. It was a dense, clinging snow, like wet cement, that began to stick to every single surface. And it was driven by a wind that was suddenly, alarmingly alive. What had been a brisk breeze just hours before was rapidly escalating, building from a breeze to a gale, and then toward a roar. The wind moaned through the new telegraph wires, a low, ominous hum that was getting louder by the minute. Then came the thunder. In the midst of the swirling snow, the sky was torn open by flashes of lightning. It was a terrifying, unnatural sight, a phenomenon known as thriller snow. The brilliant blue-white flashes illuminated a world that was suddenly, unnaturally white. The accompanying cracks of thunder were muffled by the snow, but they were terrifying, a sign that the atmosphere was in a state of violent turmoil. The storm's first victim was the city's nervous system. The heavy, wet snow began to cling by the pound to the thousands of miles of telegraph and telephone wires. The sheer weight was immense. The city's first witnesses were the invisible night workers. Milkmen, preparing their wagons, were the first to encounter the storm's shocking ferocity. They stepped out into a world that had not existed when they went to bed. Bakers, stoking their ovens, felt a new, biting cold seeping through the walls and heard the wind beginning to shriek. The city's formidable police force, many of them Irish immigrants, began their patrols, bundled against the sudden cold, unaware that their duties were about to change from keeping the peace to saving lives. On the rivers, the ferries that served as the primary link to Brooklyn and New Jersey made their final, perilous, late-night crossings. Captains wrestled with their wheels as the wind tore at their vessels, and the water turned to a churning, white-capped blackness. By 3 in the morning, the wind was no longer moaning. It was a deafening, high-pitched shriek. It was already piling the heavy snow into small drifts, and the first sharp, cracking sounds could be heard in the darkness. They were the sounds of overburdened tree branches, and the first of the telegraph wires, giving way under the impossible, icy load. Monday morning, March 12, 1888. Across New York City, alarm clocks rang. People woke in the muffled, heavy silence, a strange quiet that felt wrong. The normal morning roar of the city, the clatter of wagons, and the cries of vendors was gone. It had been completely and utterly swallowed by the storm. A man in a tenement might have gone to his window, wiping the thick condensation from the cold glass, and would have seen ... nothing, not the street, not the building across the way, just a solid, swirling, impenetrable wall of white. When New Yorkers opened their front doors, they were met not with a dusting of snow, but with a solid, chest-high wall of it. Over a foot had already fallen, but the wind was the real enemy. It was now gusting to 80 miles per hour, a true white hurricane. This wind was not just blowing the snow, it was pulverizing it. It turned the heavy flakes into fine, blinding particles of ice, a horizontal spray that felt like needles on any exposed skin. The sheer force of the wind stole the breath from your lungs. Visibility was reduced to less than half a block. Familiar landmarks, street corners, and entire buildings vanished in the disorienting whiteout. But this was the Gilded Age. This was a city of grit and commerce. The city's workers, conditioned to believe in the virtue of labor, did the impossible. They tried to go to work. That decision, that simple, ingrained act of habit, would be a fatal one for many. The journey was not one of blocks, but of feet. Men who lived just streets away from their jobs found the commute to be a life-threatening ordeal. They fought for every single step against a wind that was solid, a force that physically pushed them backward. The city's transportation system, the pride of the modern age, collapsed in minutes. Horse-drawn omnibuses and streetcars, the workhorses of the city, plunged into unseen drifts and became hopelessly stuck. Their drivers, blinded and freezing, cut the horses loose and abandoned the vehicles where they stood, creating new, larger obstacles in the buried streets. The horses themselves, powerful draft animals, strained and whinnied in the drifts, their grunts of effort muffled by the snow, until they too became exhausted and began to freeze. The first fatalities were reported early that morning. They were not from spectacular accidents, but from simple, grim exhaustion. Men who, dressed in their normal winter coats, were found frozen in snowdrifts just yards from their own front doors. Shopkeepers who had managed to battle their way to their stores found themselves alone. The streets were utterly deserted. Schools, in a bizarre act of bureaucratic denial, were technically declared open, but attendance was near zero, as parents wisely and fearfully kept their children home. There was one way across the East River, the Great Brooklyn Bridge. A few hundred souls, desperate to get to their jobs in Manhattan, attempted the crossing. It was a treacherous passage, a walk into the teeth of the hurricane. They had to cling to the railings as the wind howling through the steel cables threatened to pick them up and hurl them into the churning, icy water below. The city that had woken up with so much confidence was, by 9 a.m., utterly and completely paralyzed. It was a city in a state of collective, stunned disbelief. The complete shutdown of a city like this is a powerful reminder of nature's force. It's a story of infrastructure and of human resilience. Are there any other historical events, natural disasters, or forgotten stories you would be curious to explore in a future episode? I would love to see your ideas in the comments. For now, let's witness what happened when the city's iron arteries, the proud elevated railroads, began to freeze and break. As the city of New York reeled in shock from the first blinding assault of the storm, its very infrastructure, the pride of the Gilded Age, began to fail. The city's confidence was built on a framework of iron and copper, a system designed to conquer time and distance. And now, that system was being torn apart. If you had stood in Manhattan on any normal day in 1888 and looked up, you would have seen the sky choked by a dense, chaotic web of wires. It was a staggering sight. Thousands upon thousands of lines for telegraphs, telephones, stock tickers, and for the crucial police and fire alarms. This was the city's nervous system, and its brain was the massive Western Union building on Broadway and Day Street, a grand cathedral of communication, the hub that connected New York to Boston, to Washington, D.C., and to the entire world. But this marvel of engineering had a fatal flaw. It was all exposed. The snow that fell on that Monday was not the light, fluffy powder of a winter postcard. It was heavy, wet, and relentlessly sticky. It clung to every single wire, and as the freezing wind howled over it, this snow formed into thick, heavy cylinders of ice, some as thick as a man's arm. The weight was immense. It was astronomical. Sometime mid-morning, the breaking began. It started not all at once, but as a series of sharp, sudden reports, like gunshots echoing in the muffled air. A thick wooden telegraph pole, burdened with the weight of over 150 ice-laden wires, would groan under the strain. And then, with a sound like a giant cracking a bone, it would snap. When one pole went, the tension would rip through the connected lines, pulling down the next pole and the next in a domino-like cascade of destruction. The air was filled with the dangerous, whip-like sound of tensioned copper wires breaking free, lashing through the storm like angry serpents. Massive, tangled nests of broken wires, heavy with ice, fell into the streets, creating a new and lethal hazard. They blocked paths, they tangled in the wheels of abandoned wagons, and they lay hidden in the deepening drifts. The most terrifying of all were the electrical wires. This was the dawn of the electric age, and these live lines, carrying a powerful, deadly current, fell into the snow. They announced their presence with eerie, sizzling sounds and brilliant, blue-green flashes, shorting out in the drifts, turning the snow itself into a deadly trap. Mayor Hewitt, in a desperate attempt to regain control, sent out wire-cutting crews. These were brave men, tasked with the near-impossible job of navigating the blizzard to find and cut the most dangerous lines, to try and manage the lethal mess. But the storm was too powerful. The destruction was too widespread. By midday, the brain of the city had been silenced. In the grand Western Union building, the frantic clatter of telegraph keys faded. One by one, the lines went dead. Boston, silent. Philadelphia, silent. Washington, silent. The nation's nerve center was suddenly and completely isolated, cut off from the rest of the world, alone in the storm. On Wall Street, the incessant, rhythmic clatter of the stock tickers, the very heartbeat of American capitalism, stopped. The silence that fell over the brokerage houses and newsrooms was profound. It was unnatural. It was the silence of a system that had simply ceased to be. Panic and confusion spread among the few brokers who had made it to their offices. The city was blind, deaf, and mute. Perhaps most critically, the fire alarm boxes on the street corners went dead. In a city built of wood and brick, packed with flammable tenements, this was a terrifying development. If a fire broke out, there was no way to signal for help. The alarm could not be raised. A blaze would have to be reported in person by a citizen forced to fight their way through chest-deep snow and hurricane-force winds just to reach the nearest firehouse. The great network that had promised a future of instant connection was now a tangled, frozen, and lethal ruin. And this single catastrophic event, this snapping of the wires, would become the undeniable catalyst for one of the city's greatest future projects, the decision that New York's vital arteries must never again be left exposed to the sky, and must from that day forward be buried deep underground. But as the city's nervous system was being severed on the ground, a more immediate and terrifying drama was unfolding in the sky. The city's circulatory system was its elevated railroad. Every morning, these small, powerful steam locomotives pulled wooden cars packed with commuters, running on iron tracks suspended dozens of feet above the streets. They were the symbol of New York's relentless forward motion. On that Monday morning, in a fateful act of duty and denial, the trains had attempted to run their morning schedules. They were packed with thousands of commuters, men and women who had fought through the morning's chaos, believing the train to be a guaranteed refuge, a sure path to their destinations. They were wrong. The locomotives, powerful as they were, relied on the simple friction of steel on steel. But the tracks were now coated in a thick, slick layer of ice and wind-blasted snow. The wheels began to spin uselessly. The engines wheezed, their steam condensing instantly in the frigid air, and one by one they lost traction. All over the city, the trains ground to a halt. They did not stop in the relative safety of the stations. They stopped in the most exposed, most vulnerable places possible, on the high, open trestles between stations. One of the most dramatic and well-documented events occurred on the 6th Avenue line. A train, packed with passengers, stalled just north of the 23rd Street station, suspended high over the street. At first, the mood inside the car was one of cynical, frustrated annoyance. This was New York, after all. Delays were part of life. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, and then 2, annoyance turned to a cold, creeping dread. The small coal-fired steam heaters in the wooden cars were quickly overwhelmed. Then the train's coal and water supplies began to run out. The locomotive's fire died, and with it, the last source of warmth, a penetrating, intense cold, began to seep into the cars. It came up through the floorboards and through the rattling window frames. Passengers, dressed for a commute, not an Arctic expedition, huddled together for warmth, their breath fogging the air, the windows frosting over from the inside. And then there was the wind. The hurricane-force gusts, now unobstructed, tore at the elevated structures. The wooden cars began to sway, a sickening, rhythmic, nauseating motion that convinced many they were about to be thrown from the tracks and onto the buried street far below. The wind howled through the floorboards, a relentless, deafening shriek that drowned out all conversation, a sound that seemed to come from a furious, alien world. Outside the windows, the city itself had vanished. There was no street, there was no ground. There was only a swirling, vertical vortex of white. Panic began to set in. Desperate passengers, fearing they would suffocate or freeze, broke windows to get air, only to let in a fresh, biting blast of snow and ice. Some men, in their terror, considered a suicidal jump. Conductors and engineers, in a display of incredible, selfless bravery, climbed out of their cabs and onto the icy, narrow walkways. They tried to clear the tracks by hand, using shovels and their bare, freezing hands, all while being buffeted by the 80-mile-per-hour winds, dozens of feet in the air. It was a hopeless, heroic, and futile effort. In a famous, and perhaps apocryphal, account, one man, a passenger on a stalled train, allegedly used one of the still intact telegraph wires to shimmy, hand over hand, from the swaying train to the window of a nearby building. A desperate act of aerial survival. For most, there was no such escape. There was only the cold and the waiting. Eventually, the city's fire departments were called. But this was a rescue operation unlike any they had ever attempted. They had to raise their longest ladders, which were instantly coated in a thick, heavy glaze of ice, making them impossibly heavy and dangerously slick. A firefighter would climb the swaying, ice-covered ladder, the wind tearing at him to reach the panicked passengers. Then, one by one, they would guide the freezing men, women, and children out of the train car and onto the ladder, a perilous descent to a street they could barely see. By early afternoon, the entire elevated system was officially shut down. The city's circulation had stopped. Thousands of people, now rescued from the sky, were stranded far from their homes, with no way to get there. They flooded the nearby hotels, they overwhelmed the police stations, and they crammed into any saloon that offered a warm stove and a glass of whiskey. The chaos in the sky had descended to the ground, and now the storm began to attack the very fabric of the city's society. In the stratified world of the Gilded Age, class was everything. Your wealth, your name, and your station in life dictated where you could go, what you could do, and who you could speak to. On March 12, 1888, the blizzard became the great equalizer. The snow, the wind, and the cold were profoundly indifferent to wealth and status. A man in a fine silk top hat froze just as quickly as a laborer in a rough woolen coat. The storm rendered all men equally powerless, equally small. Perhaps the most famous story of this phenomenon was that of Roscoe. He was a lion of the era, a wealthy, powerful, and famously robust politician, a former senator, a kingmaker in the Republican Party. That Monday, Conkling found himself stranded on Wall Street. Confident in his own strength, he refused to take shelter. He decided, instead, to walk from his downtown office to his home at the New York Club, a distance of nearly 3 miles. It was a fatal miscalculation. He battled the storm for hours, a solitary, powerful figure, fighting a force he could not defeat. He eventually collapsed, delirious and exhausted, in the snows of Union Square, just short of his goal. He was found and rescued, but the ordeal had broken him. He would die just a few weeks later from the exposure, a famous, tragic victim of the storm's indiscriminate fury. For those less powerful, and perhaps more prudent, the city became a patchwork of makeshift shelters. The grand hotels of Lower Manhattan, like the famous Astor House, were mobbed. Their lobbies were transformed into chaotic, steaming dormitories packed with stranded businessmen, Wall Street tycoons, and clerks, all reduced to the same basic need for shelter. The smell of wet wool, cheap whiskey, and expensive cigar smoke filled the air. Fortunes were paid for any available space. Men slept on floors, on benches, and even on the green felt of the hotel's billiard tables. The city's hundreds of saloons did a roaring trade. They were beacons of warmth and light in the blizzard. Their doors were thrown open, offering warmth from a pot-bellied stove, a measure of whiskey, and, most importantly, shelter from the wind. In the crowded, humid rooms, a low, anxious murmur of conversation replaced the usual boisterous laughter as strangers, stripped of their social titles, shared news, rumors, and a common sense of bewildered disbelief. For those with no money for a hotel or a saloon, the police stations became sanctuaries. Precinct captains, in a citywide act of public service, opened their doors. They took in the homeless who were facing certain death, and they sheltered stranded families, working men, and lost children, offering a hard floor to sleep on, but a shelter that was, for that night, the difference between life and death. The opulent, private clubs of the wealthy on Fifth Avenue, normally bastions of exclusivity, were transformed into dormitories for their own stranded members. Factories and offices, unable to send their workers home, became impromptu shelters, with employers housing their staff overnight on the floors of the workshops. The storm, in its overwhelming force, had dissolved the city's rigid social barriers, creating a temporary, fragile community of shared survival. But this equality had its limits. In the crowded tenements of the Lower East Side, the city's poorest residents faced a unique and terrifying danger. Many lived in slum-like basement dwellings, apartments dug out below street level. The snow, piling into massive drifts, now buried their doors and their windows, sealing them in. They were trapped in the dark, in the cold, their exits completely blocked by a solid wall of ice and snow. As the day wore on, food supplies in the stranded parts of the city began to dwindle. A new, more human crisis emerged: price gouging. Desperate parents, with children to feed, found that the price of basic goods, like milk and bread, had suddenly skyrocketed. A loaf of bread that cost a nickel in the morning now cost $1, a price that few could pay. Families were torn apart. Children were stranded at schools or at friends' homes, while their parents, trapped in downtown offices, were frantic with worry, with no telegraphs or telephones to find out if their loved ones were safe. The city, a collection of 1.5 million individuals, had become a city of small, isolated islands of humanity, all huddled against a common, overwhelming enemy. As the cold, gray light of Monday finally began to fade, a profound darkness fell over the city, and the storm, far from weakening, redoubled its efforts. Nightfall on Monday, March 12th, brought a new kind of terror. The city, which had spent the day in a state of chaotic, frantic struggle, now fell into a new and frightening state, a frozen, entombed silence. But it was not a peaceful silence. It was a silence asterisk, underneath asterisk, the sound of the storm. The wind, which had howled all day, now settled into a relentless, deafening, thunderous roar. It was a constant, oppressive noise, a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the buildings. It was the only sound in the entire city, a terrifying replacement for the familiar urban hum of wagons, trains, and voices. For those trapped in their homes, it was a night of profound isolation, A family huddled in a cold water flat, listening to the rhythmic, heavy thump of snow and ice being hurled against their windows by the wind. They would look at each other in the flickering light of a single candle, the room casting huge, dancing shadows on the walls, and know with certainty that no help could possibly reach them. The storm continued unabated, dumping snow at a rate of 2 to 3 inches every hour, all through the night. The official accumulation in Central Park was measured at over 21 inches, but this was a meaningless number. The wind, in its fury, was sculpting the landscape, creating monstrous, sculptural drifts that were reported to be 30, 40, and in some places, 50 feet high. Under this impossible, accumulating weight, the city began to break. The roofs of weaker structures, like stables and warehouses, gave way. They collapsed with sudden, muffled groans, burying everything and everyone inside. As coal supplies ran out in home after home, families faced a terrible choice. They began to burn their furniture to stay warm, breaking up chairs, tables, and dressers to feed their stoves, the smell of burning varnish mixing with the cold. The greatest fear was of a medical emergency. With travel impossible and all telegraphs down, there was no way to call for a doctor. A child's croupy cough, a sudden fever, or an injury became a life-threatening crisis, to be endured alone in the cold and the dark. The city's milk supply, the lifeline for its thousands of infants and children, was completely cut off. The milk wagons were buried. The trains from the countryside stopped. A secondary, silent crisis was beginning. In the city's harbor, the scene was one of pure nautical destruction. Hundreds of ships, from small schooners to large steamships, were torn from their moorings, wrecked or grounded. Sailors, caught in the rigging, froze to death where they clung, their bodies discovered days later, encased in ice. And in the streets, the terrible, disorienting power of the whiteout claimed its victims. Many of those who died that night were found just yards from their own front doors. They had made a desperate run for safety, become disoriented in the swirling, featureless white, and, in their exhaustion, had fallen, succumbing to the cold, just feet from the warmth they were seeking. The long, cold, and dangerous night had truly begun, and the city, entombed in snow, could do nothing but wait for the storm to break, or wait for the city to break first. It is remarkable how a storm could erase the lines between rich and poor, even for just a day. Can you think of a time when you saw a community come together in an unexpected way? As you reflect on that, let us see what dawn revealed on the second day. After the long, terrifying night of frozen silence, a new day finally came to the entombed city. Tuesday, March 13th. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the relentless, deafening roar of the wind began to subside. The air no longer shrieked. It settled into a weary, sighing moan, and then into an almost profound quiet. The snowfall, which had been a blinding, horizontal assault, softened. The flakes lightened, drifting down more gently, and then, by the afternoon, they stopped. Across New York, in homes and hotels, in police stations and saloons, the survivors of the night began to stir. They awoke to a quiet they had never known, and as the storm clouds finally began to break apart, a strange, unfamiliar light filled the sky. The sun, a pale, watery disk at first, grew in confidence. It broke through the gray, and its rays touched the city. The world was set ablaze in a dazzling, blinding, crystalline white. New Yorkers, emerging from their shelters, stepped out not into a city, but into a new and alien world. It was a landscape of profound, shocking, and terrible beauty. The streets were gone. In their place were vast, undulating white deserts, canyons of snow, and mountains that had not existed 48 hours before. The city's familiar, rigid geometry had been erased, replaced by the soft, sweeping, organic curves of the wind. Landmarks were simply ... gone. Union Square, a place of paths and benches, was a vast, unbroken, white plain. The tops of street lamps, which had once lit the sidewalks, now poked through the drifts like small, forgotten buoys in a frozen ocean. The sight was surreal. People found they could stand on a snowdrift and look down at the tops of those street lamps. Entire two-story brownstone buildings were completely buried. The snow had drifted up to their roofs, sealing their front doors under 20 feet of hard-packed snow. The only way out was to climb. Citizens, in a state of quiet awe, began to exit their homes, not through their doors, but by climbing out of their second-floor windows, lowering themselves onto a landscape that was now level with their bedrooms. The silence was the most profound change. The constant, grinding roar of the city, the clatter of iron wheels on cobblestone, the shouts of vendors, the hiss of the elevated trains, ... It was all gone. The only sounds were the muffled, echoing shouts of neighbors calling to one another across the white expanse, their voices sounding strange and small in the snow-choked air, and the constant, rhythmic crunching of boots on snow as the first brave explorers ventured out. They found a world of tunnels and bridges to get to their own front doors. Many had to dig long, dark tunnels down through the snow, emerging from a white cave onto their buried stoops. Neighbors dug to connect their houses, creating small, subterranean networks of communication. The drifts had created snow bridges, massive, hard-packed ridges of snow that spanned the buried streets. People could now walk from one side of an avenue to the other, high above the ground, passing directly over the roofs of abandoned carriages and wagons that lay completely invisible, entombed 10 feet below. The air itself was different. It was crisp and clean and cold. The usual city smell of coal smoke and grime had been scrubbed away, replaced by the pure, clean scent of cold, fresh air. But the light was what held them captive. The bright, almost painful glare of the sun, reflecting off the endless, sparkling white, forced people to squint. It was a beauty that felt holy and dangerous. And in this new, white, quiet world, the first instinct of many was not to panic, but to check on their neighbors. A powerful, unspoken sense of community, forged in the shared ordeal, rippled through the city. People, climbing from their windows, immediately began to dig toward the houses of the elderly or of families with children, their first priority to ensure that those around them had survived the night. Photographers, sensing a historic, unrepeatable moment, ventured out into the drifts, their heavy wooden box cameras and tripods in tow. They clambered onto the snow mountains, capturing the iconic, ghostly images that now define our memory of the storm. Images of a city humbled, a metropolis transformed into an Arctic wonderland, and the children. For the children, after the initial awestruck quiet, this new world was a paradise. The monumental drifts, some rising 30 or 40 feet, became the greatest slides and forts a child could ever imagine. The sound of their muffled laughter as they slid down the drifts was perhaps the first true sign of the city's returning life. But this beautiful, silent world was also a prison. The city was paralyzed, buried under an estimated 20 million tons of snow. The awe-inspiring views were, for the city's government, a logistical nightmare of catastrophic proportions. The city had to be unburied, and it had to be unburied fast. With the city's services completely crippled, the people themselves became the city's salvation. Mayor Abram Hewitt, a man of action, understood the dual nature of the crisis. The city was physically trapped, and a huge portion of its working-class population was now unemployed and, with food supplies cut off, facing starvation. He made a brilliant, simple proclamation. Any able-bodied man who was willing to shovel snow would be paid $2 a day. In 1888, this was a magnificent wage, the equivalent of nearly $60 today for a single day's work. It was a call to arms, and the city's working poor answered it in their thousands. They came from the tenements. They came from the stranded immigrant neighborhoods. They were Irish, German, and Italian. They were laborers, dock workers, and factory hands, all suddenly united in a single purpose. They formed what the newspapers would call the shovel brigade. This was not a job for plows. The snow was too deep, too hard-packed, and the plows, drawn by horses, were useless. This was a war that had to be fought by hand with the simplest of tools, a shovel, a pickaxe, and human muscle. The work was back-breaking, cold, and wet, but it was a lifeline. The shovel brigades, numbering in the tens of thousands, were a sight to behold. In the frigid air, you could see the great plumes of steam rising from the hot, sweating bodies of the workers as they dug into the drifts. The air was filled with a new sound, not the shriek of the wind, but the rhythmic, scraping, and crunching sound of hundreds, and then thousands, of shovels digging into the packed snow and ice. They worked with a shared, desperate purpose. Their efforts created a sense of camaraderie, a decentralized, massive, and surprisingly effective example of civic cooperation. Strangers worked side by side, united by the simple, physical task before them. They began to carve canyons through the snow. They would start at opposite ends of a block and dig toward each other, creating narrow one-way paths that were, in some places, 20 feet deep. The visual progress was slow, but it was satisfying. A path, a connection. The first priority was to clear the tracks for the railroad lines coming into the city. Food and coal were the city's lifeblood, and that blood had stopped pumping. The railroad companies hired thousands of their own workers, sending them out from the city to clear the lines, meeting the crews that were digging their way in from the countryside. The snow they cleared could not just be piled up, it had to be removed. The shovel brigades loaded the snow onto any cart, wagon, or sleigh that could be freed from the drifts. These vehicles were then driven, slowly and precariously, to the city's edges. At the docks of the East and Hudson rivers, a new, strange spectacle unfolded. A constant stream of carts arrived, and the men would dump their loads of heavy, dirty snow over the edges. The rivers, which were already choked with ice, turned into a thick, white slush. The smell of the salty river water mixed with the cold air as tons upon tons of the blizzard were returned to the water. Shopkeepers, desperate to reopen, paid boys a few cents to dig small, narrow tunnels from the newly cleared pathways to their front entrances, allowing them to open for business even if their shops were still buried in a snow cave. It was a monumental human effort. It would take over a week just to clear the city's main thoroughfares, and nearly 3 weeks to clear all the side streets. But this massive cleanup effort did more than just free the city. It provided a desperately needed economic injection for the city's working poor, a paycheck that allowed them to buy the food that was, thanks to their own labor, just beginning to trickle back into the city. It was a city, with its own hands, digging itself out of the grave. And as the shovel brigades dug, as the paths were cleared and the city slowly reconnected, the true, tragic human cost of the storm began to be tallied. The snow, in its beautiful, indifferent whiteness, had been a shroud, and as it was slowly pulled back, the city began to find what it had lost. The tone of the newspapers, which had been one of awe and disbelief, became more somber. The lists of the missing, which families had posted in desperation, were slowly, heartbreakingly, being cross-referenced with the lists of the confirmed dead. The final, official death toll for New York City was over 200 people. Across the entire region, from the Chesapeake Bay to the far reaches of New England, the storm had claimed more than 400 lives. The causes of death, listed in the papers, were grimly repetitive: exposure, freezing, and the one that spoke to the desperate struggle of that Monday morning: overexertion. These were the heart attacks, the strokes, the exhaustion of men who had fought the wind until their bodies simply gave out. The victims were not found in dramatic or spectacular circumstances. They were found in quiet, tragic tableaus. Many were discovered frozen, just steps from the safety of a shelter or their own front door, in eerily lifelike poses. A delivery boy, still clutching his packages, a mother, shielding her child. The story of policeman William H. LaHaye from the Bronx captured the city's heart. He was a man who had refused to abandon his post. He had completed his long, dutiful patrol in the teeth of the hurricane, and was found, days later, frozen solid in a snowdrift, a silent sentinel, a testament to the city's sense of duty. The tale of Roscoe Conkling, the powerful politician who had died after his defiant 3-mile walk, became a sobering, cautionary tale for the city's elite. It was a story that proved no amount of wealth or power could protect you from the storm's simple, cold arithmetic. The dead came from all walks of life. They were laborers and businessmen, carriage drivers and stockbrokers. The city's morgues were overwhelmed. Bodies had to be stored in temporary, makeshift locations as the city struggled to cope with the sheer scale of the loss. In the newly cleared pathways, the mood was often quiet and respectful. A crowd would part in silence as a blanket-covered body was carried out of a snowbank. People would read the newspaper lists in the street, their faces grim, rustling the pages as they scanned for a name they hoped not to find. Here and there, a small, simple bouquet of flowers would be placed in the snow where a victim had been found. The lonely, echoing sound of a single hammer could be heard as someone nailed a notice about a missing person to a wooden post, a sound of desperate, fading hope. The economic cost was also staggering. The city, in its paralysis, had lost an estimated $20 million. In today's money, that is well over $500 million. It was a crippling blow to the world's financial capital. The city, as it dug, was forced to confront its own fragility. The beautiful, awe-inspiring landscape was also a mass grave, a reminder of the 200 souls who had been lost, swallowed by the white hurricane. But New York is, and always has been, a city of relentless, forward momentum. The thaw, when it came, happened with the same surprising speed as the storm itself. Just days after the blizzard had ended, as the city entered the weekend, the temperatures began to rise. A new, warm wind, this one from the south, began to blow. The Great Freeze was over, And with the thaw came a new universal sound, the constant, gentle, percussive dripping of water. It was the sound of the storm's release. Water dripped from every roof, from every icy wire, from every tree branch. The snow mountains began to weep. This created a new set of problems. The melting snow, with nowhere to go, caused widespread flooding. The city's sewers, still clogged with ice, backed up. The newly cleared streets became rivers of brown, icy slush. The feeling underfoot was no longer the crisp, hard-packed snow, but a thick, ankle-deep, and freezing mud. But the city's pulse was returning. Within just 2 or 3 days, began to run again, though on limited schedules. The sight of the first train, hissing steam and clattering on the tracks, was a powerful symbol of returning normalcy. The New York Stock Exchange, the frozen heart of the city's commerce, reopened its doors on Thursday, March 15th. The port, cleared of its ice and its wreckage, reopened as well. Ships carrying the vital supplies of food and coal were finally able to dock, and the city, which had been facing a true crisis of starvation and cold, could breathe a collective sigh of relief. The great blizzard, almost overnight, passed into legend. It became the new benchmark for time. People would talk about things that happened before the storm or after the storm. I survived stories became a kind of social currency. People bought souvenir photographs of the massive drifts to prove to themselves and to others that what they had just lived through was real. The immense piles of snow, now blackened with soot and uncovered garbage, took weeks to melt completely. They lingered on the sides of streets and in the parks, stubborn, dirty monuments to the white hurricane. But the most lasting effect was the smell. As the snow melted, it revealed everything the city had discarded for a week. The air, which had been so clean and pure, was now thick with the smell of uncovered garbage, of the damp, thawing earth, and of a city, in all its messy human reality, reawakening for spring. The final, lingering silence was broken. The city's voice, in all its chaotic glory, returned. The shouts of vendors, the clatter of wagons, the arguments, the commerce, and the movement. The city was itself again, and so the great white hurricane passed into legend. The city thawed, the streets filled once more, and the impossible, frozen silence was replaced by the familiar, welcome roar of New York. The storm was a brutal, terrifying teacher, but its lessons would echo for decades to come. Thank you for joining me through the heart of the blizzard. If you have enjoyed our story so far, a like or a kind comment is always deeply appreciated. Now, as the city recovers, our story shifts, looking beyond the snow to the lasting changes it carved into the future of New York. The snow always melts. It is a simple, inevitable truth. After the paralysis, the fear, and the heroic, desperate struggle for survival, the thaw finally came to New York. The great, frozen city began to breathe again. The ice that had turned the East River into a polar bridge cracked and groaned, its fragments floating away to the sea. The mountains of white on Broadway and Wall Street, monuments of frozen chaos, slowly sank into gray slush and running water. The clatter of wagons on cobblestone, a sound silenced for days, returned like the first birdsong of spring. But as the physical grip of the storm loosened, its true, lasting impression was only just beginning to form. The city had not just been through a storm, it had been through a reckoning. As the last of the snow was shoveled into the rivers, New Yorkers looked up at their city, and they no longer saw a marvel of the Gilded Age. They saw a victim. they saw a symbol of progress brought to its knees by wind and water. The thaw revealed the profound vulnerabilities that had been hidden in plain sight. The silence of the telegraph, the failure of the trains, the darkness of a city cut off from the world. The disaster was not just a natural one, it was a man-made one. It was a failure of design, a failure of foresight, and a failure of hubris. And so, in the quiet, muddy aftermath, a new chapter began. This was not a story of survival, but of reflection. It was a story of how a city, humbled by nature, decided to rebuild itself from the ground up and from the bedrock down. This final chapter is a scholarly epilogue, a quiet exploration of the profound and lasting legacy of the Great Blizzard. We will examine how this single, catastrophic event became the direct catalyst for some of the most massive engineering and public works projects in American history. We will see how the failures of 1888 forced a paradigm shift, giving birth to the subway system, clearing the skies of their tangled wires, and reshaping the city for the coming 20th century. The storm was over, but its echoes were about to be etched in steel and in stone. The first and most glaring wound that the city had to address was transportation. In the days and weeks after the blizzard, the postmortems began in the press and in the halls of power. And one failure was held above all others, a singular symbol of the city's helplessness. This was the paralysis of the elevated trains. These iron dinosaurs, symbols of New York's modern power, had become useless, frozen coffins, trapping thousands of people in the sky. They were the great promise of the age, a way to float above the mud and crowds of the city streets. But the storm had revealed their fatal flaw. They were exposed, vulnerable, and in the face of a true blizzard, they were nothing. The public, which had once celebrated the elves, now viewed them with a mixture of anger and betrayal. This public outrage was the political lever that one man had been waiting for. That man was New York's mayor, Abram Hewitt. Hewitt was a reformist, an engineer, and a man who had already been a vocal proponent of a radical and vastly expensive idea. He believed the city's future lay not in the sky, but in the earth. He believed in an underground transit system. Before the blizzard, this idea was controversial, even fanciful. It had been debated for decades, but it was always stalled by a potent combination of cost, engineering challenges, and powerful political opposition. The very idea of tunneling under the city was frightening to many. They imagined buildings collapsing, the air being unbreathable, the tunnels filling with water from the nearby rivers. And even if it were possible, the cost was astronomical, beyond anything the city had ever attempted. But the blizzard changed the calculus of possible. It gave Mayor Hewitt the political capital he had desperately needed. He seized the moment, famously and publicly declaring, "We must have a transit system that is stormproof." That single, simple phrase cut through all the arguments, all the lobbying, and all the fear. It was no longer a debate about convenience or cost. It was a debate about survival. In the wood-paneled rooms of City Hall, the atmosphere was electric. You can imagine the scene. The heated public debates, the gavel rapping to call for order. Where once the lobbyists for the powerful, elevated train companies held sway, now there was a new, undeniable voice. This was the voice of the public, unified in its demand. Newspapers, which had been skeptical for years, now ran bold, capital-letter headlines. The most famous and the most simple was just 2 words: never again. This cry was echoed in the Chamber of Commerce, in the boardrooms of banks, and on the floor of the stock exchange. The low murmur of conversation among the city's business leaders was one of grim realization. The blizzard had cost them fortunes. The economic paralysis was a warning. A city that could not move its people was a city that could not do business. The elevated train companies, who had so effectively lobbied against a subway for years, suddenly found their arguments falling on deaf ears. Their product had failed, and the city was ready for something new. And so the engineers returned to their drafting tables. But this time, they were not sketching a theoretical dream. They were designing a practical reality. Almost immediately after the storm, serious new proposals for a rapid transit subway system were being drawn up. The scratch of an engineer's pen on drafting paper was the sound of a new city being born. They were sketching the first lines of the tunnels, calculating the grades, and solving the problems that had once seemed insurmountable. The greatest of these challenges had always been ventilation. A steam-powered subway, like the one in London, was a dirty, unpleasant, and potentially lethal idea for New York. The thought of suffocating in a soot-filled tunnel was a major part of the public's resistance. But here, technology and history converged. The blizzard arrived at the precise moment that a new solution was becoming reliable. This was the magic of electric traction. The advent of reliable, powerful electric motors meant that a subway could be built without fire, without smoke, and without steam. It could be clean, bright, and, most importantly, safe. The same electrical science that had been trapped in the frozen overhead wires was about to be harnessed to create its storm-proof solution. With the political will, the public demand, and the technological solution all falling into place, the path was finally clear. It still took time. The inertia of government is a powerful force. But in 1891, the state legislature passed the Rapid Transit Act, a piece of legislation that laid the formal, legal groundwork for the subway system. It was the blizzard codified into law. Finally, on a day in 1900, 12 years after the Great Storm, a ceremony was held. Ground was officially broken for New York's first subway line, the Interborough Rapid Transit, or I. As politicians gave speeches and a silver spade was struck into the earth, the memory of 1888 was on everyone's mind. The subway, which would grow to become the circulatory system of the entire metropolis, was a direct and acknowledged legacy of the blizzard. It was an argument for a city below, an argument made not with words, but with 54 inches of snow. The storm had forced the city's transit into the earth, but it also forced the city's nervous system to follow. Just as the blizzard had revealed the fatal flaw of the elevated trains, it had exposed the absurd vulnerability of the city's communications. In 1888, New York's sky was not the open, clear expanse we know today. It was a chaotic, tangled mess. For decades, the city had allowed telegraph, telephone, and electrical companies to string their wires on massive, ugly wooden poles. This great tangle was a visual representation of the Gilded Age itself. It was a chaotic, unregulated, and astonishingly fast-growing web of private interests. This web of wires was not just an eyesore. It was a profound and constant danger. The wires, often poorly insulated, would snap and fall, electrocuting horses and pedestrians. They were a nightmare for firefighters, creating a deadly, sparking obstacle course during any blaze. They were a constant fire hazard themselves, a fragile network of electricity and communication, all of it held up by rotting wood. And then the blizzard came. The wind and the ice did in 3 days what reformers had failed to do in 3 decades. They tore that tangle apart. The weight of the ice, combined with the hurricane-force winds, snapped the poles like twigs. The sky fell, burying the streets in a lethal spaghetti of iron and copper wire. The result was a total communication blackout. This was the final straw. For days, New York, the financial and media capital of the world, was as isolated as a remote frontier outpost. The stock exchange was dark. Newspapers could not get dispatches. Businesses could not send or receive orders. And most terrifying of all, the fire alarm system was dead. The city was blind and mute. This complete and total failure of the system, a failure that cost lives and fortunes, galvanized the public and the government. The utility companies, particularly the powerful Western Union, had fiercely resisted all previous attempts to force them to bury their lines. The reason was simple: expense. Digging trenches through the streets of New York was a costly, difficult proposition. It was far cheaper to simply add another wire to an already overburdened pole. But after the blizzard, their arguments were meaningless. The public and the press were furious. The cost of not burying the wires had just been made devastatingly clear. Legislation was quickly passed, mandating that all wires be placed in underground conduits. It was no longer a request, it was an order. This was an undertaking of almost unimaginable scale. It was, in its own way, as ambitious as the subway. It meant digging thousands of miles of trenches through the city's streets. And this was not soft earth. This was Manhattan. This was an island of solid bedrock, the hard, unforgiving Manhattan schist. The sound of this project was the sound of a new, more resilient city being forged. It was the loud, percussive, relentless chipping of pickaxes against stone. It was the rumble of drills, the shouts of foremen, and the clatter of wagons hauling away the debris. Deep trenches ran along the major avenues, revealing the layers of earth and stone beneath the cobblestones. Into these trenches, workers carefully laid the new infrastructure. They placed bundles of terracotta or iron pipes, the conduits that would house the delicate wires. These pipes were then encased in concrete, a fortress to protect them from water and time. The air was filled with the acrid smell of hot tar used to waterproof the newly laid lines, sealing them from the elements that had so recently destroyed their predecessors. The process was slow, it was methodical, it was grueling, and it took the better part of a decade to complete. But as the trenches were filled in and the streets repaved, a second, more visible transformation was happening. The massive, ugly telegraph poles were being dismantled. One by one, they were chopped down and carted away. With each pole that fell, the sky opened up. This project permanently changed the look of the city. It gave New York the cleaner skyline we are more familiar with today. If you look at a photograph of New York in 1880 and then one from 1910, the difference is startling. The visual chaos is gone. The contrast is a satisfying one. The image of a city cleaning up, organizing itself, and burying its vulnerabilities. And the benefits were not just aesthetic. The most important result was the reliability of the fire alarm system. With the wires safely underground, a fire alarm box became a dependable link to help. That quiet underground network, born from the blizzard's chaos, would go on to save countless lives in the decades to come. New York's solution became a model for the nation. Other American cities, watching the catastrophe and the recovery, followed its lead, burying their own utility infrastructure. The great tangle was gone, untangled not by careful planning, but by a violent storm that forced the city's hand. The blizzard had left a lesson in the air itself, a lesson that the only true safety was in the bedrock below. These grand engineering projects, the subway and the conduits, were the most visible legacies of the storm. They were the concrete and steel solutions to physical problems. But the blizzard also left a deeper, more subtle mark. It left an echo in the city's psyche. It taught a profound lesson in humility. The Gilded Age was a time of immense confidence, a time of boundless faith in progress and technology. Men had built bridges across great rivers, strung wires that carried voices across states, and built towers of commerce that scraped the sky. There was a sense that humanity, or at least American humanity, was on the verge of conquering nature itself. The blizzard of 1888 was a cold, brutal, and deeply personal refutation of that idea. It was a profound shock to the Gilded Age's sense of invincibility. It reminded the city, in the most painful way possible, that modern technology was still no match for nature's primal power. All the telegraphs, all the trains, all the wealth on Wall Street had been rendered useless by frozen water. This lesson in humility rippled out, changing the city's approach to the world. One of the first and most important reforms was in the science of weather itself. The U.S. Weather Bureau, which was then a part of the Army Signal Corps, had failed to predict the storm's severity. In the quiet, studious atmosphere of their offices, meteorologists re-examined the charts. They studied the storm's path, its barometric pressure, its fatal turn toward the coast. This failure led to a significant push for reforms. There was a new demand for more weather stations and for better placed ones, particularly along the coast where these storms developed. The blizzard of 1888 became a foundational case study, a ghost that haunted the new science of meteorology, pushing it to be better, more accurate, and more humble. The storm also entered the city's folklore. It became the benchmark, the ultimate test. For an entire century, every new snowfall was measured against it. You can imagine a grandparent sitting by a window and watching a new storm, telling a wide-eyed grandchild, "This is nothing. You should have seen the great blizzard. You should have seen 1888." It became a defining, unforgettable experience for the generation that lived through it, a shared trauma that bound them together. This experience fostered a new and lasting appreciation for the city's municipal workers, the sanitation crews, the firefighters, the police. These were the men who had worked heroically, often to the point of collapse, to dig the city out, to save lives, and to restore order. They had been taken for granted, but the blizzard had revealed them as the true front line of civilization. From this revelation, the very idea of coordinated emergency management was born. Before the blizzard, the city's response to disaster was chaotic and ad hoc. But in the aftermath, hospitals, charities, and city agencies began to develop new contingency plans. They started to ask, what if this happens again? What is our plan for a mass casualty event? What is our plan for a total infrastructure collapse? The city planner, poring over a map, was no longer just designing a city for growth. He was redesigning a city for resilience. The lessons were everywhere. The storm had highlighted the extreme vulnerability of a just-in-time food supply. The city had nearly starved. This led to calls for larger reserves, for a system that could withstand a multi-day blockade by ice. Even architects and builders learned a lesson. They began to consider snow load and wind resistance more seriously in their designs. The blizzard's ghost was now in the building codes, a silent partner in every new construction. But perhaps the most lasting lesson was in the city's character. The storm reinforced and, in many ways, created the modern identity of New York. It was an identity of toughness. It was the idea that the city and its people could endure anything, that they could be knocked down by the worst nature had to offer, and they would get back up, rebuild, and come back stronger. The story of the blizzard humbled their faith in progress, but it forged their faith in themselves. And so, our story comes to a gentle close. We have walked the frozen streets of 1888, and we have now followed the long, quiet echoes of that storm through the following decades. We can see that the blizzard is not just a story of the past. Its ghosts are very much alive, and they are all around us in the modern city. You can feel them if you know where to listen. You can feel them in the rumble of a subway train deep in the bedrock, carrying millions of people, safe and warm, on a snowy day. That rumble is the legacy. It is the sound of the city's storm-proof heart, a heart that was forged in the blizzard's ice. You can see them if you know where to look. When you stand on a street in Manhattan and look up, you see the clean lines of skyscrapers against the sky. You see the buildings, the clouds, and the sun. What you do not see are the wires. That clear, uncluttered sky, that vast open space, is a testament to the blizzard. It is an absence that speaks volumes, a quiet memorial to the great tangle that was swept away. The legacy is there, written in iron, on the manhole covers beneath your feet. On a cold day, you can see steam rising from them, a reminder of the vast, hidden network that keeps the city alive. If you look closely at some of the older covers, you might even see the names: Consolidated Telegraph and Electrical Subway Company, or Empire City Subway. These are not just manhole covers. They are physical artifacts of the Great Burial, tombstones for the wires that once choked the sky. This resilience, this toughness, this ability to learn from disaster became the city's foundational myth. It is the character that the city would call upon again and again in later crises. After the attacks of September 11th, or in the wake of Hurricane Sandy, you would hear echoes of 1888. You would hear that same spirit of endurance, of community, and of a grim determination to rebuild. The blizzard of 1888 is more than a memory. It is embedded in the city's bones, in the steel of the subway tracks and the quiet space where a million wires used to be. It is a silent, foundational story of survival and rebirth. It's always fascinating to see how a single event can change history's course. If this look at the storm's legacy was interesting, please let me know. As we leave these lessons of the past behind, we have just a few more quiet moments to spend with the people who lived through it. The storm marked a true turning point. It accelerated New York's transformation from a chaotic, vulnerable Gilded Age city into a modern, resilient 20th century metropolis. It taught, with brutal clarity, the interconnectedness of urban systems, a lesson that is more relevant today in our own complex world than ever before. And in the quiet of a museum, you can still find the photographs. You can see the faded, black and white images of a city buried. You can see the drifts piled as high as the street lamps, the sleighs on Broadway, the men standing atop snowdrifts with a mixture of awe and exhaustion on their faces. When we look at these 130-year-old images, we feel a quiet reverence. They are a timeless reminder, a reminder of the delicate, fragile balance between our grandest civilizations and the profound, humbling power of the natural world. A reminder that even in an age of wonders, We are all, in the end, subject to the weather. As the echoes of the great blizzard fade, as the lessons are learned and the new city is built from the bedrock up, we are left with just the story. We have a few more quiet moments to spend together, not with the grand lessons of history, but with the people who lived through it. With the thaw, 1,000 strange, small, and curious stories began to emerge from the drifts. These are the frozen footnotes of the storm. They are the details that require no focus, the gentle anecdotes perfect for this quiet final part of our journey. Settle in as we explore the strange, the curious, and the quiet memories of the great white hurricane. This was a storm that defied all logic, and it created moments of pure absurdity, fear, and surprising ingenuity. In the warm, flickering light of a kerosene lamp, as families were finally reunited, these were the stories they told. One of the most famous belonged to a man named Chauncey Depew. Depew was a railroad tycoon, a president of the New York Central Railroad, and a man of immense power. He was, in short, a man used to the world bending to his will. But the storm did not care. He was trapped on one of his own trains, just outside New York City, for 2 full days. The engine was cold. The snow was piled high over the windows, and this powerful, wealthy man, a symbol of the Gilded Age, survived the same way any man would. He and his fellow passengers lived on a dwindling supply of dry crackers and a single precious bottle of whiskey. You can almost imagine the quiet, civilized clinking of that bottle, as the most powerful men in New York were reduced to sharing sips in the dark, humbled by the snow. The wind, as we know, was a screaming, physical force. But some of the reports from that day seemed to border on the supernatural. In the Bronx, it was reported that the wind, which was filled with sharp particles of ice, was so strong and so relentless that it had skinned a cat alive. It is a grim, shocking detail, one that speaks to the sheer, unimaginable violence of the air itself. It was a wind that did not just push, it scoured. With the streets impassable, people resorted to the strangest methods of travel. The wind was so powerful that to stand was to be knocked over. Many people, in a desperate attempt to get home, were forced to crawl on their hands and knees, staying low to the ground to keep below the main force of the wind. They moved through the city like infants, humbled. Others, seeing the deep drifts, fashioned makeshift snowshoes. They were made from anything, the backs of kitchen chairs, wooden crate lids, anything to distribute their weight. The sound of the storm was the roar of the wind, but the sound of the city was the muffled, desperate crunch of people walking on their own furniture. Yet, even in the midst of this cold, white chaos, life, in its most determined form, found a way. In a stranded, frozen train car, a baby was born. We do not know the mother's name or the full story. But we know that in that dark, cold, and terrifying place, a new life began. Her parents, in a moment of poetic inspiration, gave her a name that would forever tie her to the event. They named her Snowdrop. The soft cooing of a newborn, a sound of impossible hope, was a counterpoint to the storm's unrelenting roar. And where there is chaos, there is also, always, opportunity. This was especially true for a daring young boy named John Queenan. He saw the wealthy, stranded businessmen of his city, men in their fine wool coats, shivering and lost. Many were stuck at the foot of the Brooklyn Bridge. So, John offered his services. He knew the back alleys. He knew the drifts. For $5 a head, a truly astronomical sum for a boy to charge, he acted as a guide. He led these men, one by one, from the exposed bridge to the safety of nearby hotels. He was a small, bright spark of Gilded Age capitalism, and he reportedly made a small fortune that day. The storm even left its mark on our language. It is said that the old phrase, "son of a gun," received a new boost in popularity. It was a term that sailors used, a rough nickname for children who were born at sea on a ship. And as New Yorkers looked out their windows at the howling blizzard, as they heard the wind scream through the tangled wires like the rigging of a ship, it felt right. The storm's fury was not of the land. It was a naval battle, a tempest of the open ocean, and it had brought its strange nautical fury to the avenues of Manhattan. There were other strange sensory details. Many people, after the storm, claimed that the snow itself had not been purely white. They insisted it had a strange yellow, or even a brownish tint. At first, this seems like a trick of the memory, or a symptom of the general chaos, but it was likely true. The wind was so powerful that it whipped up the dry dust from the unpaved streets, the soot from a million coal chimneys, and the pollution of the Gilded Age city. It lifted this grime high into the atmosphere and mixed it with the falling snow, staining the flakes before they ever reached the ground. The city was a place of surreal, frozen tableaus. At the winter quarters of the famed Barnum and Bailey Circus, a whole herd of terrified circus animals was stranded. We can only imagine the sounds: the roar of a lion, the trumpet of an elephant, all of it muffled by the falling snow. These were creatures of warm climates, trapped in a polar vortex, a strange and terrifying addition to the city's paralysis. Human ingenuity, or perhaps just stubbornness, was on full display. The snowdrifts were so high they buried the first-floor doors, and the streets were impassable. So, how did people cross? In some neighborhoods, enterprising people set up ladders. They ran them from one second-story window across the street to the second-story window of their neighbor. They then charged a fee for this precarious, high-wire act. It was a city of bridges, and for a few days, new, temporary, and very wobbly ones were created by ordinary people. And, like any great disaster, the blizzard created its own myths. A popular rumor began to spread, whispered in taverns, and printed in speculative newspaper columns. This storm, some said, was not natural. It was caused by the government. It was a failed experiment, a test with powerful new explosives that were meant to create rain, but had instead torn a hole in the sky and brought down the heavens. It was a story people told themselves, perhaps because a human error, however catastrophic, was less terrifying than the alternative, that the universe, by its own quiet logic, could simply decide to erase them. From these curious events, we move to a quieter and perhaps sadder part of the story. We turn our gaze to the animal life of the city, to the silent sufferers of the great storm. The Gilded Age city was a city of muscle, and that muscle came from the horse. In 1888, New York had a population of over 150,000 horses. This is a staggering number. They were the engines of everything. They pulled the public streetcars, the private carriages, the milk wagons, the fire engines, and the carts that carried all the goods of a great metropolis. The sound of the city was not the sound of traffic. It was the sound of iron horseshoes on cobblestone. When the blizzard struck, these animals were the most vulnerable. Hundreds, perhaps even thousands, of them perished in the storm. Their masters, their drivers, were often forced to make an impossible choice. When a wagon or a streetcar became hopelessly stuck in the deepening drifts, the driver, to save his own life, would have to abandon his team. The horses, loyal and patient, were left to their fate. Many froze to death exactly where they stood. You can imagine the sad, quiet sight: a horse standing in its harness, its breath turning to frost in the cold, dark air. It would stand there, waiting for a command that would never come, as the snow slowly, gently buried it. The ASPCA, which was already an active organization in the city, was completely overwhelmed. They were flooded with rescue calls, but they too were paralyzed. They could not possibly answer the tide of suffering. One incident, more than any other, seemed to capture the tragedy. On the Bowery, a team of horses pulling a streetcar was abandoned. The driver, unable to free the car, unhitched them but could do no more. The horses were left to fend for themselves, but they were trapped by the drifts. When the thaw finally came, days later, they were found. A team of horses, frozen solid, still standing in their harnesses. They were a silent, tragic statue, a monument to the storm's unfeeling power. For weeks after the blizzard, as the snow melted, the bodies of horses were a common and heartbreaking sight. They were revealed, one by one, as the white drifts receded, still attached to the carts they had been trying to pull. It was not just the great working animals. The city's huge population of birds was also decimated. New York was home to millions of English sparrows, an invasive species that had, by then, become the city's most common bird. They were a constant, chirping presence. The storm was a true extinction event for them. The tiny birds, with their light, hollow bones, had no defense against the cold and the wind. They tried to find shelter under the eaves of buildings, but the cold was too intense. In the days after the storm, the silence of the city was noted by many. It was not just the lack of wagons, it was the lack of birdsong. There were, of course, moments of kindness. In their own homes, people fought to save their animals. Families brought their pets, their dogs and cats, inside. The image of a small dog, curled up by a warm fireplace, safe from the storm, is a comforting one. In some cases, people even brought their working animals into their homes. There are reports of families sharing their kitchens with their chickens, a strange, domestic scene of shared survival. But many animals were in stables, and they were not safe there. The snow was so heavy, so wet, that it was more than many roofs could bear. Stables, with their often weak and poorly maintained structures, were the first to go. Their roofs collapsed under the immense, silent weight, killing the animals inside. They died in the dark, buried before they ever had a chance to freeze. The loss of so many horses had a severe practical impact on the city's recovery. In the initial days, the cleanup was slow, and a major reason for this was a sudden, catastrophic shortage of horsepower. The very animals needed to pull the sleighs and carts, the very engines that could clear the snow, were gone. The event did not go unnoticed. It led to a quiet but important public discussion. It forced the city to confront its total dependence on these animals, and to think, perhaps for the first time, about the morality of their treatment. The storm had revealed the fragility of this horse-powered system, and in its tragic, silent way, it had made an argument for a new kind of city, one that would soon be powered by engines of steel, not of muscle. Having remembered the city's animal inhabitants, we turn our attention to the world outside the city. The blizzard was born on the water, and it was there, at sea, that its fury was most absolute. We turn to the stories of the frozen harbor, and the ships that never made it home. On land, the storm was a blizzard. At sea, it was a hurricane. The wind, with no buildings or hills to slow it, was a solid, screaming wall of force. The waves, it was later reported by the few survivors, were monstrous, rising over 50 feet high. In the open ocean, it was a deafening, endless roar of white water and black sky. The toll on the maritime world was catastrophic. Over 200 ships, from small fishing sloops to large merchant vessels, were either grounded, sunk, or wrecked beyond repair. They were lost all along the eastern seaboard, from the Chesapeake Bay to Maine. The human cost was just as terrible. At least 100 sailors died at sea. Their deaths were often slow and agonizing. As the ships were coated in a thick, heavy layer of ice, the rigging became unusable. Men who climbed the masts to try and manage the frozen, ripping sails were flash frozen by the spray. The supercooled seawater, whipped up by the wind, would freeze the moment it touched them. They were found, days later, frozen to the masts, their hands still reaching for the ropes. The rigging of these ghost ships was encased in a thick, ghostly shell of white ice. The port of New York had its own specific guardians. These were the Sandy Hook pilot boats. They were small, fast, and incredibly seaworthy vessels, crewed by the most experienced sailors in the world. Their job was to meet the large, incoming ships and guide them safely into the harbor. They were the gatekeepers. On the day the blizzard struck, 20 of these pilot boats were on duty, waiting for ships. The storm fell upon them with a sudden, unmatched violence. Of the 20 boats on duty, only one, by a sheer miracle, survived. The other 19 were lost, taking with them the core of the harbor's maritime expertise. The harbor itself was choked. It was filled with a thick slurry of sea ice, and with the wreckage of the vessels that had almost made it to safety. Navigation was impossible for days. The city, which lived on the goods that came from the sea, was completely cut off. Its great lifeline was frozen and blocked. The islands around the city were utterly isolated. Staten Island was completely cut off from the world. The ferries, its only connection to Manhattan, were unable to run. The ice was too thick. They were trapped for nearly a week, a small world of their own, surrounded by the frozen, impassable water. But even in this naval chaos, there were stories of incredible heroism. The crew of the wrecked ship Alfred S. Taylor found themselves stranded near Long Branch, New Jersey, their ship breaking up around them in the pounding surf. They were facing a certain cold death. But the men of the U.S. Life-Saving Service, a precursor to the Coast Guard, launched a heroic and seemingly suicidal rescue. In the middle of the blizzard, they rowed a small boat through the impossible waves, time and time again, until every man on that ship was saved. The storm's reach was vast. It devastated the fishing fleets of the entire coast, the oyster boats of the Chesapeake, the cod fishermen of New England, the small boats of Long Island Sound. Livelihoods that had been built over generations were wiped out in a single, terrifying night. The power of the storm was so great that it physically altered the earth. In some areas, the pounding waves and currents created new, temporary sandbars where there had been deep water. In others, it tore away whole sections of the coastline. For weeks after the storm, the sea offered a long, somber funeral. Debris from the wrecked ships washed ashore. The beaches of New Jersey and Long Island were littered with splintered masts, broken hulls, and the lost cargo of 200 ships. It was a final, silent testament to the blizzard's power, a power that was born, and was, at its most terrible, on the water. From the tempest at sea, we come to our final resting place. We come to a peaceful reflection on the storm as it passed out of the world of wind and ice and into the quiet realm of history and of memory. An event of such terror, such chaos, does not simply end. It transforms. Over time, the sharp edges of fear and desperation begin to soften. The trauma fades, and what is left is the story. What is left is the wonder. The blizzard of 1888 became a cottage industry for a new kind of artist, the photographer. Men like J.H. Hare and George E. Stacy ventured out into the silent, buried city with their large format cameras. The quiet click of their shutters in the muffled, snowy streets was the sound of history being captured. They sold prints and stereoscopic cards of the snow scenes, and people were hungry for them. At first, these images were a form of disaster journalism. They were a way for people to see, with their own eyes, the impossible things they had heard about. The drifts at 20 feet, the streetcars buried to their roofs, the tunnels cut through the snow. But as the years passed, these images, initially so shocking, are now seen as beautiful. They are works of art. The stark black and white contrast, the soft sculptural curves of the drifts, the way the snow transformed a dirty, chaotic city into a pristine, white, silent world. The survivors of the storm, as they grew older, felt a bond that no one else could understand. They formed a formal group, calling themselves the Blizzard Men of 1888. They would meet every year for decades to commemorate the event. You can imagine their reunions, the low, respectful murmur of old men, their voices filled with the quiet pride of those who had endured. They would share their stories, their private memories, and raise a glass to the city they had helped dig out. The story was also passed down through generations. It became a piece of family lore for thousands of New Yorkers. It was a story told at the dinner table, a badge of honor. Your great-grandfather, a child might be told, walked from Harlem to Wall Street that day. It became a personal, tangible connection to a great and legendary event. As we have heard, the storm became the benchmark. For the next 100 years, every time a snowstorm hit New York, the weather reporters would ask the same question: is it a big one? And the answer would almost always be, it is. But it's no 1888. It was the standard against which all other storms were measured, and always found wanting. It is important to remember how we remember this event. We have no film of the blizzard. We have no audio recordings. We cannot hear the wind. We cannot see the snow falling. Our entire visual and emotional understanding of the event is filtered. It is filtered through the written accounts, the newspaper articles, and, most powerfully, through those silent, still, black and white photographs. This filtering, over time, has an effect. It has softened the sharp edges of the terror. It has quieted the screams of the wind and the cries of the suffering. It emphasizes, instead, the awe-inspiring, static beauty of the buried city. When we look at a faded, sepia-toned photograph, we are held at a calm, safe distance. We are able to experience the wonder of the event without any of its terror. It is a peaceful, meditative experience. The storm came to mark a boundary in time. For the generation that lived through it, their lives were cleanly divided. They would talk about events as happening before the blizzard or after the blizzard. It was a wall of ice that stood in their memory, separating the old world from the new one. It represents one of the last great natural disasters to strike a major American city in an age before mass media. There was no radio, no television. The news spread by the click of the telegraph once the wires were repaired, and by the paper in a boy's hand. It was an event experienced in isolation and then shared slowly as the city re-emerged. In the end, the memory of the blizzard is a testament. It is a testament to the profound, humbling power of the natural world. But it is also a testament to the human capacity to endure the unthinkable, and then to transform that traumatic event, to pass it down, to photograph it, to tell its stories, until the terror becomes a legend, and the chaos becomes a story of resilience, and of strange, and terrible, and beautiful wonder. And so, the great white hurricane finally settles, not into drifts of snow, but into the quiet landscape of our memory. A storm of unimaginable fury, now a peaceful, sleeping story. Thank you for spending this time with me here at the Sleeping Scribe. Your presence makes this community what it is, and I am truly grateful for it. If you found this story calming or interesting, I hope you'll consider subscribing and joining us again. Until next time, I hope your thoughts are peaceful and your rest is deep. Sleep well.